Okay, so over the next week and a half, 2 weeks, we're going to really get into textures and using textures in combination with shaders to get some pretty cool effects. For today, I just want to focus on some of the different ways you can use textures and applying them to just kind of simple planes for now, just to get used to it. So what I have right now in the scene is this wall that is actually just a plane. So if I click on it, you can see this is the actual geometry, but using a handful of different image textures, you can get this result. And I'll kind of walk you through it. So there's a displacement texture on it. There's a normal map. There is a specular roughness map, and there is also the color map, the diffuse map. So I'm not going to worry about creating new textures today. We can talk about that more next week. But all these textures are pulled from Texture Haven. It's one of a few different places where you can get these textures. This one in particular is, let's see, I always miss this one. For whatever reason, I can't seem to find it on this page. It's not brown brick. If I just go to like rock, it'll pop. Nope, not rock. Bricks. I think it might be this one. Yeah, that looks about right. And so you can download all the maps, and that's what I did. I think I did the 4K resolution. JPEG is fine. And I don't use them all, but it's good to have them all. I have also posted on D2L a few different websites where you can find additional textures, all for free, of varying quality. Some are only 1K textures. That's kind of why I like Texture Haven. Free PBR is another one, I believe, that has 4K textures. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure. But some resources to check out. Polygon has, I think, 50 free texture packs. The rest you do have to pay for. There's various subscription models. I'm not saying you have to pay for any textures, but just making you aware of kind of what's out there. So I have this texture pack that I downloaded. When you download it, what you want to do is copy that into your source images folder for your project. And this is the folder, rough block wall. It was a zip file. I unzipped it, and this is what you get. So you get, here's an ambient occlusion pass, which we're not going to worry about. Here's a diffusion, so this is just the color information. Here is the displacement texture. And then there is a normal map, which is like a bump map, but a little bit different. Here is the specular roughness and ambient occlusion roughness, which I'm not going to worry about. So I'll go through each of these individually. I just wanted you to see kind of what you get when you download a texture pack. And I'm actually going to do this, and you can do this as well. Texture Haven. This is just the metal plate texture. So texturehaven.com, textures, metal plate. And I'm just going to download all maps. Let's see, have I already done that? I can't remember. I have already downloaded it, so that's what I'm going to work with. And in order to kind of understand how this works, we need light too. So I'm going to do a, actually, I'm just going to, let's see, how do I want to do this? I'll do a new scene so you can kind of follow along. And I'm going to add a plane, and this is what the metal plate is going to be applied to. Oops. I'm just going to uniformly scale it up a bit. And then I need some lights so that I can see what's going on. So I'll add a default sky. I'm going to select that sky and just scale it down to 0 because I don't like seeing the black background. And then I'm going to add one additional light, just a little plane here. I'll move it up, rotate it. Oops, grab the center. Okay, good enough. I'll probably need to adjust that intensity. Actually, I'll do that right now. Just set the intensity to 5 and the, if I scroll down, no, sorry, right there. and the exposure I'll set to 5. And that'll be a good starting point. So I'm going to go through each of these textures individually so you can see what they do on their own, and then we can combine them together. And I will start with the diffuse because that's pretty obvious. But we need to have our hypershade open for this. So screen real estate's going to get a little bit limited for this recording because it's a tiny screen, but I'll do my best. So what we need to do, first and foremost, is select our ground plane and assign a new material, Arnold Shader Standard Surface. Cool. So with our standard surface, we've got all of our properties here. I'm going to adjust the kind of size of this area here. Try to give myself some space to work. We will be working in this node editor here, the graph editor. So we have our normal categories that we're used to. We've got our base, which is kind of normal color stuff, specular, so highlights, some reflections, transmission, so if light passes through, subsurface, if light enters it and bounces around. Think about milk or wax, skin, things like that. Clear coat, if we want to do some car paint sort of stuff. Geometry is where our bump map is, and a bunch of other options we're not going to worry about right now. So, like I said, we're going to start with the color map. So for the base color, this little checker pattern is where we're going to add our textures. So I'm going to click on that. It's going to open up this Create Render Node window, and I want to add a file texture to it. So click File, and we've got a couple more nodes that are attached to our standard surface shader, right? Okay, so as we add components to this, we're going to see this network grow, and it makes sense. Here's the texture mapping, here's the texture that we're going to load up, and then that goes into the color, and then that goes out to the final surface. So it's a logical flow. I'm going to click on this file node, and we have here our image name. Click on that folder, navigate to my metal plate and metal plate diffuse, diff, okay? And that's, you can see a preview of it, and that's what I want. Click open. So I do that, it's going to take a second. You can see our shader ball preview is going to update in our 3D viewport. If we select the object and hit 6 on the number pad, you can see we now have our texture. The texture size is a little bit big for what I'm going for. And so to adjust that, I'm going to go to my Place 2D Texture node, and I just want to repeat the texture a few times. It's going to have the effect of scaling it down. And I'll see if I can do this in a way that you can also see the results live. Nope, I don't want to do that. Come on. Why did it just resize? Okay. There we go. Oh, it combined with my outliner for some reason. There we go. Okay. Let's try this one more time. Okay. So I'm gonna, my repeat UV, let's go like 5 and 5. Okay. Now you can see that's much smaller. You can also see that this tileable texture isn't super tileable because we can start to see this pattern emerge, which I don't love. We'll do something like that. Go 4 and 4, it's a little bit less obvious. All depends on what your needs are, but we'll just go with it for now. So that is the diffuse shader, that's the color. That's kind of the obvious use of a texture, right, is just giving it color. This is a photo that is taken instead of something that you would like hand draw or paint. And it works. One note about these textures, when you're kind of evaluating what is a good and not a good texture, obviously if you want it something that's going to be repeatable, that's going to be tileable, you want to not see that repetition, so these kind of faint grids that you can start to see emerge, not ideal. Other things you want to look for is you don't want to see any obvious lighting information, because if you see an obvious light in just that image, then when you try to add your own lighting, it's going to kind of compete and look weird and not natural or realistic. You also want that image to look like it should be shot straight on. You don't want to see any kind of perspective or distortion in it. Again, because when you apply that to a flat surface, it's going to kind of work against your camera. So most of the textures that you'll find on the dedicated texture sites will be fine, but every once in a while you'll come across one that doesn't quite work. So just be aware of those things to look for. So that is the color texture. I mean, I can hit render and we can see what this is going to look like. When we render, if it ever pops up, there we go. Let me orbit around to a decent view. Okay. So we can see the color is there, but you can also see that this is a very glossy thing, and it probably shouldn't be if this is like rusty diamond plate steel, right? It doesn't feel like it should be really glossy. It kind of looks like it's under a little bit of water because it's so glossy. So you can see that just adding color alone is not enough to get a realistic effect. So now let's look at how to control those glossy things with a map. So what I'm going to do to make the function really obvious is in this hypershade, I'm going to disconnect the base color. Okay, there's a couple ways that I can do that. I can either on color, I can just right click and say break connection. But because I know I'm going to reconnect it, I'm just going to right here. Let's try to make it obvious for YouTube. I'm just going to click and drag off, just kind of like pull that away and let go. And now it's disconnected. You can see that the shader ball previews as black now, or white if we pull up the slider, whatever. But I'm going to leave it all the way at black. And now what I want to do is the specular roughness map we want to apply to roughness in the specular section, right? Kind of makes sense. Specular, roughness, and you can see if we just move this back and forth, we can kind of get a really dull effect if we increase the roughness, and a really shiny effect if we bring that down to 0. What a specular map does is it does the same sort of thing, but it does it kind of on a point-by-point basis. So anything that is white is going to have a roughness of 1. So it's going to be super dull. Anything that is black is going to have roughness of 0. It's like a mirror finish. And then gray is in between, how much. So we can look at this map and you can see that all the kind of the top raised parts of this diamond plated steel are going to be super rough because they're all, lighter colors. It means there's more wear, probably less of that initial shine to it. And some of the recessed areas are going to be a little bit glossier. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to my roughness. I'm going to click on the texture. Again, we're going to do a file texture. And I can click on the folder, load it up. I'm going to go with, so there's 2 maps here. This has a specularity and a roughness. Okay, you can kind of see the differences. I'm going to go with the specular map. Click open. Okay. And I'm also going to just drag these out of the way. Okay, that's the diffuse. We don't need to worry about that. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my viewport. And you can't really see anything until you hit render. But now with that light, we should, of course we don't, but we should see a variation in that specularity. Take a look here. We've got the weight. Not quite seeing that. All right, hold on. Out the issue. So first of all, if you remember, okay, I'm going to undo that and then we'll start from here. Okay. So basically what we need to do is, within the file node, is we need to check alpha is luminance. And this is a kind of good practice to do anytime you're using a kind of a grayscale map to affect something. If it's not working, double check that alpha is luminance is checked. And again, that's in the file node here. If you don't see it, you can just right click on the material in the hypershade and graph the network, and this will pop up. You can also, from standard surface, if you're just in the kind of your normal settings, this arrow will take you to the input value. Click on that, and then you're on the file options. So check alpha is luminance, and then you can see it pops up. And now we see variation in reflectivity, right? But we also, you can see that the scale is off. So we need to do the same thing that we did with our diffuse UVs, where we repeat that 4 times. We need to do the same thing here. So I'm going to go repeat 4 and 4. There we go. So there's our specularity. Now let's talk about the bump mapping. So the bump mapping is a way to kind of fake surface detail without actually having to add it. So I'm going to disconnect the specular, just like I did with the diffuse. Actually, yeah. Okay. So we'll disconnect that. Now I'm going to go to the geometry section of my shader properties. And bump mapping, click on that. Again, we're going to add a file texture. There we go. And here, we've got an extra node that applies, and that's this bump node. This is where you can adjust the intensity of the effect. But I want to go to the input on this bump value. And this is where I will load up my image. I'm going to choose this normal. You can see there is also a bump pattern. Normal works a little bit better, and you can compare them on your own. I'm just kind of mindful of time. So I'm going to choose normal, click open, and then there's one additional thing that I need to do. Okay, you can kind of see it doing something. Well, there's a couple things I need to do. We need to repeat our UVs again, so 4 and 4. Just to get the right scale. I'm going to increase the brightness on the material just a little bit, so it's not quite so dark. And back in the bump node, we can see we've got this weird kind of these black speckles. And that's because it's using it as a bump and the depth is way too high. But instead of just bringing down the depth, I'm going to change it to using it as object space normals, because we're using a normal map. So I click on that, and it's a very subtle effect. Resolves, you can see it a little bit better, and it's even more obvious near the light. So let me move the... Let me just reframe this up real quick. Go like there. Okay. So here's what that normal map is doing, is it's giving the effect of surface detail without actually changing any of the surface. If we look at the edges, and I know it looks bumpy, but that's just because it's low resolution. There we go. So you can see the edges are still straight. Right? There's clearly no actual undulations in the surface, but we have that effect. So that's what bump mapping can do. Now, we can take this one step further and add displacement mapping. And so displacement mapping is like bump mapping in effect, but it's more accurate because it does actually move the surface around. The trade-off being that you need to add more detail to your object, and thus the render times will be increased. So it's not something that you maybe want to do for everything, but when you need it, when you can use it, it's great. I'm going to close the render view for a moment, and I'm going to disconnect this bump node. Actually, before I do that, why don't I reconnect everything just so we can see how it all looks together. So I'll leave that off to the side. See if I can... This is just not enough screen space, but we'll do our best. Okay, so you can kind of see that. We connect our color to the base color. Connect our specular roughness. Oops, is it alpha? There we go. There we go. The bump is into the normal camera is actually where that goes. And now we can see we've got a pretty good effect. You know, I'm pretty happy with that. But let's see how we can take it further. I'm going to save this screenshot. Okay, so we can compare that without the bump. And now, in the hypershade again, we have, if we look at our ultimate shader output, we have this displacement shader. Okay, and this is where we're going to plug this in. First thing we need to do is add that displacement node. So I'm going to move this up. And in the create section here, I don't know why there are bins. I'm going to close the bins. I'm just going to type in, oops, DIS. Here we go, the displacement. This is that top one. Click on that to add it. It's going to add two nodes, displacement shader, and then this kind of output shader. I'm going to delete this blue one. I don't need that. I just need this node right here. Okay? And I'm going to, oops. We're going to connect this to the displacement shader. Actually, I think it, wait. Yeah, that's what I want. And then we want to add this texture to the displacement attribute. Just this top one. Same sort of thing. We're going to file texture. And then you can see it reorganized my node editor. It's now at the bottom for some reason. But this is where I'm working here. Okay. I'm going to set my UVs to repeat 4 times, just like before. And I'm going to load up my file. This time it is disp, which that is just not showing anything, really. Hold on. Okay, that's just gray. That's not helpful at all. I should have looked through this a little bit more. Okay. Well, that kind of puts a little twist in this. Let's see if we can... Okay, we're going to use... That's actually extremely annoying. All right, we're going to use the specular map for now, just to kind of show, and then, yeah. So we'll use this one. Click open, and immediately that's not really going to do anything. Oh, also, for now, I'm going to disconnect all the things that I reconnected, so we can just focus on displacement, and I'm going to make sure that the color is a visible gray so that we can see the effects here, which we're not seeing, but we'll get to it. Okay, so I've got that displacement connected and loaded. I do want to click alpha is luminance, and then I need to go into my attribute editor. So I'm just going to object mode, select my ground plane, and there's this smooth mesh section. Expand that, and I want to turn on smooth mesh preview and displacement preview. And it's going to get real crazy. We need to modify and freeze transformations. That's going to reset some of it. And then I want to, we need to increase the render division levels. So we're going to uncheck use preview level for rendering, and I'm going to bump that up to, we'll say 7. And then the last thing we need to do is adjust the scale, because it's just pushing things way too far. So back in the hypershade, on the displacement node, we have the scale value, and that's what we need to adjust. So let's try like 0.1. Okay, that is not, still probably too much, so let's try 0.05. And you can see how it's actually moving the geometry around, and why having this division levels increased is so important, so that you have enough detail to affect that. Because see, right now it's previewing at just 2 levels. If we increase that preview, it's going to look a little bit smoother, whereas if we go down to like 1, it's really rough, and then as we increase that, it gets a little bit better. But so once we have all of that, then we can hit render again and give it just a moment. And for whatever, oh, there it goes. Okay, our light is a little bit bright, so I'm going to bring just the color down. Okay, and now this is just the displacement. There's no, there's nothing else to it. There's no color. There's nothing but the displacement. But we can see what that does. It gives this lovely richness of depth, detail, and it feels like a solid piece. Really doing a lot of work, and that's awesome. So now we can see that's just the displacement. I should also mention this is doing the same thing that the bump was doing. Or even the specular map is that white is moving it up and black is moving it down, and then gray is kind of in the middle. So it's taking a grayscale value and using that as kind of a percentage of intensity of the effect. So I'm going to reconnect everything else in my viewport. So my let me make sure I know what so this is the bump. This is going to go to my normal camera. And then this is my specular, so that's going to go alpha to specular roughness. And then this is my color, and that's going to go up to base color. And then all of them together. I'll let that finish rendering. It's going to take a little bit longer because, again, the displacement, using displacement means you need to increase your geometry, and it's just going to increase render times. But once we get there, we can kind of compare. There we go, take that snapshot. So here's without displacement, and here's with displacement. So we get shadow detail that we wouldn't get otherwise. Yeah, it's obviously more realistic. It's not something that you're going to use for everything, but it's a great thing to add when you can. So that's with the diamond plate. Let me open up. I will save this real quick. Diamond plate, and then I will open up the previous one that I did, which is this. And we can kind of break that down. So you see there is the displacement map on it. I will show you what that displacement map looks like when you're using a proper displacement map. And that is going to be right here. Okay, this is what that displacement map looks like. So the darker tones aren't moving at all or barely moving, and the lighter tones are pulling out more. Okay. And again, when you render it with all the things connected to it, it will take us a moment. And this, has an additional light for some detail, but you get this nice shadow detail and just kind of this richness that you wouldn't get otherwise.